A shocking new claim has surfaced in the disappearance of 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie, and it may point to a motive that changes everything. So, according to a report from Hindustan Times, Annie Guthrie allegedly asked her mother for a loan shortly before Nancy vanished from her Tucson home on February 1st. And reportedly,
one word. That is all it took. Not an argument, not a confrontation, not a dramatic scene that anyone could point to later and say, that was the moment everything changed. Just one word, spoken quietly, between a mother and her daughter. One word that closed a door. One word that, according to a new report, may have set something in motion that nobody in that family could have predicted. Or maybe somebody did. The word was no. Nancy Guthrie said no. And 2 weeks later, she was gone. There are cases that haunt you because of what happened. And then there are cases that haunt you because of what happened right before. Because of the quiet moments nobody filmed, the conversations nobody recorded, the decisions that looked completely ordinary from the outside while something else entirely was building underneath. The Nancy Guthrie case has always been both. It has always carried that particular weight, the feeling that the answer was never buried deep. That it was sitting close to the surface the whole time, visible to anyone willing to look directly at it without flinching. This channel has been following this case from the beginning. Every document, every timestamp, every silence that lasted longer than it should have. And in 3 months of covering this investigation, there have been details that raised questions, details that demanded attention, details that a reasonable person could not simply file away and forget.
Now, is the loan claim confirmed? No. Has law enforcement addressed it directly? Not publicly, but the pattern of financial questions swirling around Annie and her husband, Tommaso Cioni, has been building for weeks. And this is the latest piece of that puzzle.
But until now, there was one thing this case did not have. A reason, not a theory, not a guess pulled from circumstance and coincidence. A documented, reported, specific reason. A financial thread that runs from May of 2025 all the way to the morning Annie Guthrie picked up the phone and called 911. A thread that, once you see it pulled straight and laid out from one end to the other, changes the shape of everything that came before it. That thread begins with a loan request. And it begins with the word that ended it. No. Before going any further into documents and timelines and what the evidence now suggests, there is something that needs to be said clearly. Because it is easy, in a case this large, this covered, this dissected from every possible angle, to forget who is actually at the center of it. So let this be the reminder. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She is a mother, a grandmother, a woman of deep faith who attended church every single Sunday morning without exception. She raised her children largely on her own. She worked, she sacrificed, she built a life piece by careful piece. And that life took shape in a beautiful home nestled in the Catalina foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona.
Now here's where the financial angle starts to take shape and predates the loan claim entirely. Nancy's home in the Catalina foothills is valued at around $1 million. Annie and Tommaso's nearby residence is estimated at $650,000. Investigators and online sleuths alike have focused on this gap.
Home she had lived in for decades. A home worth approximately $1 million. A home filled with the kind of quiet, accumulated meaning that only comes from a lifetime spent in one place. She tended her garden. She sat on her porch. She kept to herself. She had a pacemaker that helped regulate her heart. She took medication every night at 10 o'clock, medication the Pima County Sheriff himself later said could prove fatal to miss. She wore hearing aids that came out before she went to sleep, and once they were out, she could not hear anything happening around her. She had no caretaker, no overnight help, no medical alert pendant, no alarm system, no active camera subscription. She was 84 years old, alone in a $1 million home, and completely unprotected. On the evening of January 31, 2026, Nancy Guthrie had dinner with her daughter Annie and Annie's husband Tommaso at their home. She went home afterward, and she was never seen again. Hi viewers. Here is a simple question that has been on a lot of people's minds since this case broke open. Do you think a family member is responsible for Nancy Guthrie's disappearance? Yes or no? Drop it in the comments right now. That is the woman at the center of this story. And what this channel is covering today is not a rumor. It is not speculation dressed up as reporting. It is a new claim, documented and sourced, that has surfaced 3 months into one of the most watched missing persons investigations in the country.
Only. And the Pima County Sheriff's Department has stated publicly, quote, "Not one single person in the family is a suspect. So I am telling everyone, effective today, you guys need to knock it off. Quit," end quote. But here's the thing. Clearance and closure are two very different things. In high-profile cases like this one, families can be cleared and still remain under—
A claim that gives this case something it has been missing since the very first morning. Not just a what, not just a when, a why. A financial picture that begins 8 months before Nancy disappeared and ends with boxes being carried out of her home while she is still missing and no legal process has authorized a single item to be moved. And it all starts with a word Nancy said. A word that somebody, somewhere, did not accept. The report came from a publication called Heian Times. And when it landed, it did not land quietly. According to that report, Annie Guthrie asked her mother Nancy for a loan in the weeks before Nancy disappeared. The amount is unknown. The exact date of the conversation is unknown. The reason behind the request is unknown. What is known is this. The claim has not been confirmed by law enforcement. It has not been addressed publicly by the family. And it has not been denied. Not once. Not anywhere. In an investigation this public, this heavily watched, silence around a specific claim is its own kind of answer. But here is what makes this particular claim different from everything else that has circulated around this case. It does not exist in isolation. It does not float free in the air the way rumors do. It lands inside a sequence that was already building before anyone ever heard the name Heian Times. A sequence with a beginning, a direction, and an endpoint that gets harder to look at the closer you get to it. 8 months before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, a legal document was signed. May 2025. A durable power of attorney. Tommaso Cion signed it. The document named Annie Guthrie as his agent over financial and property matters. When that document surfaced publicly, several people with legal backgrounds were quick to note that it could be entirely routine. Standard paperwork connected to a mortgage refinance or a property transfer. And maybe that is exactly what it was. But here is what that explanation does not account for. The timing. May 2025, the power of attorney is signed. Sometime in the weeks before January 31, 2026, Annie reportedly asks her mother for a loan. Nancy says no. January 31st, Nancy has dinner at Annie and Tommaso's home. February 1st, Nancy is gone. That is the sequence. And the sequence has a direction. Every single step of it points the same way. Now look at the properties. Because the numbers sitting inside this case deserve to be spoken out loud. Nancy Guthrie's home in the Catalina foothills is valued at approximately $1 million. It sits in one of the most desirable residential neighborhoods in all of Tucson. A home she had lived in for decades. A home that represented the full accumulated weight of a lifetime of hard work and sacrifice. Annie and Tommaso's home, approximately 4 miles away, is estimated at around $650,000. That is a $350,000 gap. On its own, that gap means nothing. Parents often hold more than their children. That is completely normal. But this case stopped being about what is normal a long time ago. Because when the question on the table is why Nancy Guthrie specifically, why this woman, why this home, why this level of apparent planning, the value of what she owned becomes one of the most relevant numbers in the entire investigation. The most common motive in cases where an elderly person is harmed by someone in their own circle is not rage. It is not revenge. It is access. Access to assets that become available when the person who owns them is no longer present to say no. And Nancy had already said no. Here is the part that needs to be held still and examined carefully, because it connects the financial picture to something that has been sitting in plain sight since the very first days of this case. Nancy Guthrie was completely unprotected on the night she was taken. The family dog had passed away and was never replaced. The home camera system was not actively recording. The subscription had not been renewed. Her hearing aids came out every night before bed. Once they were out, she was completely unreachable by sound. Her medication sat on the counter at 10 o'clock every night. Miss it, and the consequences could be serious. There was no caretaker, no overnight help, no medical alert pendant, no alarm system. $1 million. One woman, zero protection. Now here is what makes that fact so difficult to move past. None of those protections are expensive. A camera subscription runs about $15 a month. A medical alert pendant costs less than $1 a day. An overnight caregiver through a home health agency in Tucson costs a few $100s a week.
Comprehensible. The theory being floated online is straightforward. What if Annie and Tommaso were struggling more than they appeared? What if Nancy refused the loan, and what followed, whatever it was either a way to gain access to her assets or a reaction that spiraled out of control?
These are not extraordinary measures. These are the basic, standard precautions that families with elderly parents living alone put in place as a matter of course. The Guthrie family had the resources. Savannah Guthrie is one of the highest paid broadcast journalists in the United States. The combined income across the family was more than sufficient to cover every single one of those safeguards with one phone call. None of it was done. And if Annie was already in a position where she needed to ask her 84-year-old mother for money, and was refused, then the question of why nobody ever arranged a single one of those protections takes on a meaning that is very difficult to sit with quietly. It stops looking like an oversight. It starts looking like a calculation. A choice that left Nancy Guthrie completely reachable on the night that someone came for her. That choice matters, because whoever came through that door on February 1st walked into a home with no alarm to trigger, no camera to record them, and a woman who could not hear a single sound once her hearing aids were out. Someone knew that. The question this case has always carried underneath everything else is simple. Who knew Nancy well enough to know exactly how unprotected she was? And what did they stand to gain from the fact that she could no longer say no to anything? The dinner on January 31st was supposed to be a normal evening. It was not the first time Nancy had shared a meal with her daughter and son-in-law. It would turn out to be the last. And the last dinner Nancy Guthrie ever had with her family happened across a table from the daughter she had recently refused. Think about that table. Think about what was sitting in the room that night that nobody has ever spoken about publicly. Whatever was said, whatever was not said, Nancy got up from that table and she went home. And after that, the silence that followed was 14 hours long. At 5:32 in the evening on January 31, 2026, Nancy Guthrie requested an Uber from her residence. The driver picked her up and took her to Annie and Tommaso's home for dinner. That ride is fully documented. Timestamps intact, driver cooperation confirmed, everything on the record. Nancy arrived. She had dinner. She spent the evening with her daughter and son-in-law. And at approximately 9:50 in the evening, Tommaso Cion drove her home. 4 miles, roughly 10 minutes. No camera recorded the departure. No rideshare app generated a timestamp. No neighbor witnessed the arrival. Tommaso has said he walked Nancy inside. He has said he watched the garage seal behind her. He has said he then left. That account stands completely alone. There is no independent corroboration from any source that is not Tommaso himself. In any serious investigation, when the last known person to see a missing woman is the spouse of someone with a documented financial connection to that woman, that account does not get accepted at face value. It gets examined. It gets pressure tested. It gets held up against every piece of physical and digital evidence available until it either holds or it does not. The FBI examined it. They examined it for 40 days. But before getting to the car, stay at that driveway for one more moment. Because after Tommaso said goodnight and pulled away, something happened that this case has never been able to explain away. Something that, in the context of everything that came before it, is almost impossible to frame as an accident. Nobody called Nancy that night. From the moment that garage door sealed behind her at approximately 9:50 in the evening on January 31st to the moment Annie dialed 911 the following afternoon at 12:03, 14 hours and 13 minutes passed. During those 14 hours, not one person from that household placed a call to Nancy. Not one text, not one drive-by, nothing. Let that number sit. 14 hours. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She had a pacemaker. She was about to remove her hearing aids and become completely unreachable by sound. She needed medication at 10 o'clock that the sheriff of Pima County himself said could prove fatal to miss. She was alone in a home with no active cameras, no alarm, no medical alert device, and no caregiver. The people who drove her home knew all of this. They lived 4 miles away. And from the moment that garage closed until a church friend called the next morning because Nancy had not appeared on her Sunday morning livestream, there was nothing. Not one contact. In families where a parent is aging alone, the goodnight check is automatic. It is a 3-second text. It is a habit so small it barely registers as a choice. It exists because people care. That small, automatic habit was absent on the night of January 31st.
Fine. So what I know for certain is this. A frail 84-year-old woman who needed daily medication was taken from her home in the middle of the night nearly 3 months ago, and nobody has been charged. Her daughter, Savannah, is back at the Today Show because life has to go on. But behind every broadcast is a family still waiting. The lone claim, whether it's substantiated or not.
And its absence created something very specific. A clean, uninterrupted window. A 14-hour block where the only mechanism for discovering that something had gone wrong was a church friend noticing an empty chair on a Sunday morning livestream. The lone refusal does not change the fact of that silence, but it changes what the silence might mean. And then at 1:47 in the morning, the doorbell camera caught something. A figure, masked, standing at Nancy's front door. And then the camera went dark. What happened next was recorded by the one device in that home that nobody thought to account for. Nancy's pacemaker. At 1:47 in the morning, it logged an acute stress response. The kind of response a body produces when something is very wrong. And at 2:28 in the morning, the pacemaker lost its connection with Nancy's home monitoring unit entirely. She had been moved. Her heart was still beating. She was alive. That detail is not speculation. It is medical data. Time-stamped, logged, and now in the hands of federal investigators. Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home in the early hours of February 1, 2026, while she was still alive. And the last person to have placed her inside that home was a man whose account of those final minutes has no witness and no corroboration. The FBI wanted to look at the car. Annie Guthrie drives a Honda CR-V. Investigators seized it, and then they held it. Not for a day, not for a week. For more than 40 days. In any investigation, when a vehicle belonging to someone who has been publicly described as cooperative is taken in for forensic processing, a standard sweep takes hours. Maybe 2 days. 40 days is not standard processing. 40 days means the forensic team found something that required extended analysis. Or the data pulled from the car's onboard systems did not immediately match the account that had been provided. Modern vehicles record everything. GPS routes. Door events, speed, every function is time-stamped. If the story given to investigators was that Tommaso drove Nancy home and went directly back, the car's own data should have confirmed that story within 48 hours. It took 40 days. 40 days means investigators were not satisfied with what they found on day 1. 40 days means something inside that car needed to be fully understood before it was returned. And the FBI has not told the public what those 40 days produced. That silence is itself a piece of information. And in this case, the silences have a way of being louder than anything spoken out loud. Now think about what happened the following afternoon. Annie Guthrie arrived at her mother's home at 11:56 in the morning on February 1st. She called 911 at 12:03. 7 minutes passed between the moment she arrived at the home of a missing 84-year-old woman and the moment she picked up the phone to report it. 7 minutes. If she encountered evidence of a disturbance within the first minute of arriving, then 6 minutes passed between seeing that evidence and making the call. What happened in those 6 minutes? Did she search the house? Did she call someone first? Did she stand there deciding what to say and what not to say? The 911 recording would answer those questions. It has not been released. In Arizona, 911 recordings are public records. Reporters can legally request them. In most high-profile missing persons cases, the recording surfaces within days. 3 months into this investigation, nobody has heard a single word of what Annie said on that call. Retired Detective Bob Gilliam appeared on Chris McDonough's Interview Room podcast and addressed this directly. He said there is probably investigative information on that recording that law enforcement does not want the public to hear yet. He said not to hold your breath waiting for it. And then he said the thing that changes the weight of everything else in this case. He said the call might not surface until a trial date approaches. A trial. That word implies charges. It implies an arrest. It implies that the trajectory of this investigation, despite months of apparent stillness on the surface, leads directly to a courtroom. And the 911 call is being preserved as evidence for that proceeding. Bob Gilliam also raised a specific question about that call that deserves to be considered carefully. He asked what Annie described when she called. Did she mention evidence of disturbance immediately? Did she describe the open back door, the propped flower pot, the details of the scene? Or did she describe things with a level of specificity that a person seeing that scene for the very first time would not yet have? In cases where a family member is connected to a disappearance, trained investigators listen to 911 calls for one thing above all else. Information the caller should not yet have. Details that only make sense if the caller had prior knowledge of the scene. If Annie's call contained that kind of detail, that is precisely the kind of information that gets a recording sealed. That is the kind of information a retired detective says will not be released until a courtroom is ready to receive it. And while that recording sits sealed inside the investigation, something else has been happening in a laboratory. A hair sample was recovered from Nancy's home. A rootless hair, which is the hardest kind to analyze. It was sent to two separate facilities. The FBI's laboratory at Quantico, Virginia, and Astria Forensics in San Francisco, the same laboratory that contributed to the conviction of Rex Heuermann, the Long Island serial killer. Forensic genealogist Cece Moore is involved in the analysis. Cece Moore has resolved cases that sat cold for decades using nothing more than degraded biological material. The first search through the Cody's database came back negative. Whoever left that hair in Nancy's home has never been arrested. No criminal record, no prior convictions, a completely clean history. That result eliminates strangers. It eliminates career criminals. It eliminates random opportunity. It describes someone living an ordinary life. Someone who attends family dinners. Someone who drives elderly women home at night. Someone who signs legal documents and sits across a dinner table and says good night and drives away. The DNA does not yet have a name attached to it. But the profile it is assembling matches the financial picture this case has been building from the very beginning. And both of them are pointing in the same direction. In April of 2026, photographs surfaced. People at Nancy Guthrie's residence, carrying boxes, loading them into vehicles. Annie's Honda CR-V was visible in those photographs. Let that be stated plainly. Nancy Guthrie has not been declared dead. No death certificate exists. No probate proceeding has been opened. No court has issued any order authorizing anyone to remove personal property from the home of a woman whose disappearance remains an active federal criminal investigation. And yet the boxes were leaving. And the car belonging to the daughter who reportedly asked for a loan and was refused was present while they left. There is no publicly available explanation for what was being removed. There is no statement about why. There is no account of whose authority covered any of it. True crime reporter JLR Investigates, who has been documenting this case on the ground, posted a direct question publicly. Someone plans to move into Nancy Guthrie's home. Who could it be? The response that drew the most attention was 4 words. Someone who cannot afford their own property taxes. That response spread because people who had been watching this case for 3 months had already been asking their own version of that question. And those boxes gave the question a visual answer that was very hard to dismiss. Now here is the name that almost nobody is talking about. Cameron. Nancy Guthrie has a son. His name is Cameron. He is Nancy's child, Annie's brother, Savannah's brother. In 3 months of one of the most covered missing persons investigations in American history, Cameron Guthrie has not made a single public statement. Not one press conference appearance. Not one social media post about his missing mother. Not one interview. Not one word in any public forum anywhere. Savannah has been visible, which is understandable given her position. Annie has been part of the public narrative. Cameron does not exist in this story. And in cases of this nature, when a direct family member is completely absent from the public record for months, that absence is never random. Sometimes it is grief. Sometimes it is legal counsel saying to stay quiet. And sometimes it means something else entirely. Cameron's silence is not evidence of anything on its own. But it is a question this investigation has not answered. Where is he? What does he know? What has he been told? The questions around Cameron sit in the same space as everything else in this case. Unresolved, unaddressed, and very difficult to ignore. Meanwhile, NBC News built a specific protocol for this case. If breaking news about Nancy Guthrie develops during a live broadcast, Savannah is removed from the set. A different anchor handles the story on camera. The information is delivered to Savannah privately. That protocol was used on April 15th. She was pulled mid-broadcast after teasing a segment and returned later without explanation. 2 days after that, she was absent from the broadcast entirely. Networks do not build those procedures for cases they believe are going cold. They build them for a specific moment. An arrest, a discovery, a name, a moment that will hit a family member in real time on national television. NBC is not preparing for nothing. NBC is preparing for something they believe is coming. On May 3rd, journalist Brian Entin told Parade magazine that cooperation between the Pima County Sheriff and the FBI has meaningfully improved. Improved cooperation means movement. Movement means this case is not sitting still regardless of how quiet the surface appears. And Ed Smart, Elizabeth Smart's father, a man who understands from personal experience what a family endures in an investigation like this, appeared on News Nation and chose 3 words very deliberately. He said the Guthries have supposedly been cleared. Supposedly. That word is doing more work than any sentence around it. It is the word of someone who respects the official position while refusing to close the door on the possibility that the official position is not the final one. So here is where this case stands today. Laid out from beginning to end, one final time. May 2025. A durable power of attorney is signed. Tommaso names Annie as his agent over financial and property matters. 8 months before Nancy vanishes. Sometime before January 31, 2026, Annie reportedly asks Nancy for a loan. Nancy says no. That single word becomes the starting point of everything that follows. January 31st at 5:32 in the evening, Nancy takes a documented Uber to Annie and Tommaso's home for dinner. At approximately 9:50 that same night, Tommaso drives Nancy home. No camera, no witness, no independent record, just his account. From 9:50 that evening to 12:03 the following afternoon, 14 hours and 13 minutes pass with no contact from the people who live 4 miles away. At 1:47 in the morning, the doorbell camera captures a masked figure. The camera goes dark. The pacemaker records an acute stress response. At 2:28 in the morning, the pacemaker loses its connection with the home monitoring unit. Nancy has been moved. Her heart is still beating. At 12:03 on February 1st, Annie calls 911. The call is sealed. A retired detective says it will remain sealed until a trial date is set. Over the weeks that follow, Annie's Honda CR-V is seized and held for more than 40 days. In April, photographs emerge of boxes being removed from Nancy's home while Annie's vehicle sits outside. No legal process has authorized a single item to be moved. In May, reports surface that someone intends to move into Nancy's residence. Every item in that sequence has a version that means nothing. A power of attorney can be routine paperwork. A dinner can be a dinner. A drive home can be a courtesy. A gap in phone calls can be an oversight. Boxes can be moved for safekeeping. Every single piece, taken alone, can be explained away. But here is what 3 months of following this case makes undeniable. When every innocent explanation requires ignoring the piece that came before it and the piece that follows it, when accepting each one in isolation means pretending the sequence does not exist, the innocent explanations stop being the most likely ones. They become the ones that require the most deliberate effort to maintain. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She is still out there. Her pacemaker is still running, still counting every beat of whatever she is living through right now. She is a mother and a grandmother and a woman of faith who attended church every Sunday morning without fail. She deserves to come home. She deserves for the people who know where she is to stop pretending they do not. The DNA recovered from her home is being processed right now at 2 separate laboratories. The 911 call Annie made on February 1st is sealed inside this investigation, and a retired detective with decades of experience has already told the public exactly what that means. The telemetric data from 40 days inside Annie's Honda CR-V is in the hands of federal investigators. And the cooperation between the FBI and the Pima County Sheriff, according to reporting from May 3rd, is better than it has ever been. Something is coming. It may not arrive quietly. And when the next development in this case breaks, there is one piece of evidence that has not been discussed publicly yet. One detail that investigators have been sitting on since the earliest days of this investigation. A detail connected directly to the timeline of that night that changes the picture of what happened between 9:50 in the evening and 1:47 in the morning in a way that nothing else in this case has managed to do. That detail is coming in the next video. Do not miss it.